mental health. I do a program called the 4th R, so it's all about healthy relationships, and I work throughout the Thames Valley District School Board. So I'm in the schools, elementary schools, high schools and stuff, doing healthy relationship programming with a huge cultural component. I'm Indigenous myself, Nimkegizis Indigenicas, Ajijak and Dodom, Whitefish River First Nation in Dunjaba. So my spirit name is Thunder Day. I'm Crane Clan, and I'm originally from Manitoulin Island. But I've been down in London for probably about the past 10 years or so, doing work with all the First Nation youth in and around London. So Peter asked me if I come and do the land acknowledgement. Now I recognize a lot of people who are at the Father's Day breakfast this morning, so you guys are going to hear it again. So it's really important. It really truly is. So at this time, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of this traditional territory on which we have gathered here today and on which the University of Western Ontario now operates. This acknowledgement serves to respect the long-standing relationships of the First Nation groups of this traditional territory in southwestern Ontario. The Attawandaron peoples once settled in this region, and later the Algonquin and Haudenosaunee peoples used these lands as their traditional hunting grounds. The three long-standing Indigenous groups of this geographic region are the Anishinaabe people, also referred to as the Three Fire Confederacy, which include the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. The Haudenosaunee people, also known as the Iroquois people, or the Six Nations, including Mohawk, Oneida, Cayuga, Onondaga, Seneca, and the Tuscarora, and the Lenni Lenape peoples, who are also referred as the Munsee Delaware Nation. The three First Nation communities closest in proximity to Western are the Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and Munsee Delaware Nation, all who are within about 40 kilometers of London, where we're at right now. I would also like to acknowledge the many longstanding treaty relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this area, all across Turtle Island. Here in Canada, these treaties are lasting reminders of the nation-to-nation relationship between Indigenous peoples and the federal government. Everyone should remember their responsibilities in these relationships because we are all treaty people. So thank you very much. I'm going to pass it over to her. So I was just kidding. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Mohammed, and I'm a staff member of the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. And it is with a great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Jackson Katz, our special guest speaker for today. Dr. Jackson Katz is an educator, author, filmmaker, and social theorist who is internationally renowned for his pioneering scholarship and activism on issues of race, gender, and violence. In 1993, Dr. Katz co-founded the Mentors in Violence Prevention Program at Northeastern's University Center for the Study of Sport and Society. It was the first large-scale program of its kind in the sports culture and the military. Among its many accomplishments, MVP introduced a bystander approach to the gender violence prevention field. Dr. Katz is one of the key architects of this now broadly educational strategy. Since 1990, Dr. Katz has delivered thousands of keynote addresses and conducted trainings in all 50 states and 8 Canadian provinces, and appeared in many popular TV and radio shows, including the Oprah Winfrey Show. His TED Talk, Violence Against Women is a Men's Issue, has been viewed more than 3.5 million times. Dr. Katz is the creator of Tough Guys and Tough Guys 2, the award-winning and widely used educational documentaries. He's the author of critically acclaimed books such as The Macho Paradox, Why Some Men Hurt Women, and How All Men Can Help. Dr. Katz, a former football star, became the first man at the University of Massachusetts Emirates to earn a minor in women's studies. He holds a master's degree from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a PhD in cultural studies and education from UCLA. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jackson Katz. And just one more thing, if you have any questions to the event, please ask them by the mic in the center of the room. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all. Good afternoon. Thank you. Let me say this is a great honor for me that you're all here. It's a great honor to be working with those of you who are part of the center. Peter Jaffe and obviously a whole bunch of your colleagues are here, and perhaps not here, but working with the center has been a great part of my work for a number of years, and it's always It's always fun to be back here. So thank you for inviting me, and congratulations on your 25th century. 25th century. You've been doing this for 2,500 years, and how much progress have you really made? 25 years, quarter century of activism and intellectual, and combining intellectual and academic research with on-the-ground activism and connecting the academic side of the house to the activist side of the house, which is, I think, the most responsible use of academic intellectual capital, to be honest with you, is producing real results that are measurable in the real world. So thank you, and it's, again, great to be here. I'm going to walk out from this podium. Is that okay? You sure? Okay, I'm definitely more comfortable. And by the way, there is going to be a Q&A. Because we're doing this on Facebook Live, I'm tasked with giving a talk, but I hope that we can have a dialogue after I say a whole bunch of things, like questions, concerns, comments that people want to make. We'll open up the floor for that in about a half hour. Is that understood? Thank you. Okay. I'm going to begin with an anecdote from my personal experience in my discussions with Peter about what would be useful or interesting about what I could share with you today. Some of it has some autobiographical content, which is to say, I'll tell you about how I got involved in this work, and hopefully the arc of my activism on these matters maps in some ways other more general things that have been happening and not happening in terms of prevention of gender violence. And I'm using gender violence as an inclusive term: sexual harassment, sexual assault, domestic violence, relationship abuse, sexual abuse of children. As you know, they're all interconnected and overlapping, as well as all those issues are related to virtually everything else of import in our species. But for the moment, I'll focus on gender violence and my activism around that. But so when I was 19, which is back in the late Mesozoic era, I was a university student at the University of Massachusetts. And by the way, the setup for why I'm even telling you this anecdote is people often ask men like myself why and how we got involved, because there are not that many men involved in this work, nowhere near enough. I mean, back when I started, very few, but even today, nowhere near enough. But the men who do the work, people often ask us questions like, why do you, as a man, care so much about this? You know, why are you so passionate about this? It's unusual to hear a man who really cares about these issues. And there's usually a subtext to the question, which is something must have happened in his life. There must be some personal story. Why else would a man be so concerned? And my response to that, by the way, my first response is, if all it took for men to be involved in this work was to have personal experiences with women close to us who have been assaulted by other men, then there would be billions of men doing this work. There would be billions of us, and there would be millions of men marching on, Ottawa and Washington and sitting in at the state capitals and provincial capitals, because billions of men have been affected on a personal level by this issue, and by including harm to the women around them as well as men and boys around them, right? So it's obviously got to be more than just a personal experience of a man. I think that's one of the notes of how depoliticized our culture is in North America, by the way, and how many other larger problems we have as a society, that you have to have a specific personal reason to stand up for basic justice. You have to have a personal tragedy in your family to care about fundamental dignity of human beings and respect for people across the gender and sexual spectrum and racial and ethnic spectrum. You know what I'm saying? It's like it shows you how low our expectations are, as opposed to you doing it because you're a good person and because these are big problems in our civilization and in our species. And it doesn't have to be a personal trauma that projected you forward. Having said all that, I didn't have a specific incident in my life. There was no specific woman in my life who was the victim of some kind of violence, harassment, and abuse. And I know that there are probably, I was looking across the hall, there's a therapy sort of book, display out there, and there's probably people here who are trained as therapists. So let me just say preemptively, I know it's more complicated than what I'm about to tell you. I know that everybody has a more deeper emotional and relational and familial experiences than I can possibly begin to share with Facebook Live right at this moment. So let me just tell you, the anecdote I'm about to share is not in totality how I got involved. Just like everybody in this room, if we went around the room and asked people their experiences, it's complicated. People have complicated lives and relational lives and childhoods and everything else, mine as well. Anyways, I was 19 and I was a university student at the University of Massachusetts. And I was well, I was living in a co-ed dorm, right? A co-ed dorm, and it was co-ed by room, which is to say I was in a room with my male roommate, but on both sides there were women who were my hallmates. And I remember going home from parties, coming home from parties at 2 or 3 in the morning, not worrying about my personal safety at all, not even thinking about it. 20,000 person campus, and you know, most people in my cohort, white men of that generation, and even to this day, a lot of white guys just walk through the world not really worried in certain situations about our personal safety. I'm not saying it's smart, but I'm telling you it's normative. And I remember thinking how much I enjoyed my freedom to do come and go as I pleased. Then I remember thinking about how my women hallmates had a completely different life, and they had a completely different experience of freedom, or the attenuation or the lack of freedom because of such a fear of sexual assault, such a fear of the other sex, if you want to use the binary, the other sex assaulting them. And I remember thinking, if I were a woman, I would be so ticked off about this, having to live like this, constantly worried. Then I was a journalist for the student newspaper. We had a daily paper with 20,000 circulation, and I wrote a weekly column, but I also covered some events as a reporter, and I was covering a rally on campus organized by women students for better lighting on campus. Better lighting, which is a very basic public safety intervention. And there had been a couple of rapes on my campus outside in a parking lot. Now, as you know, most rapes that happen on college campuses happen inside. 90% of the perpetrators know the victim, 90% of the victims know the perpetrator. So this stranger kind of in the bushes jumping out, it happens, but it's much less common. But there were a couple rapes that happened outside, and these women were organizing for better lighting. And I remember covering this rally and seeing these women, and it was all women, and thinking, not that they were bashing men, or that they hated men, or they had some agenda against men, but rather, this is what leadership looks like. These women are standing up for themselves. They're standing up for themselves and other women and girls, as well as men and boys, everybody who has the right to walk across campus without being afraid of being sexually assaulted. And I saw them as inspirational leaders rather than women who were bashing men. And I said this to the group of men this morning, young men, the boys at the Father's Day breakfast that Peter and colleagues organized. I said, imagine how you would feel if you had to always worry about your personal safety. And then wouldn't you hope that you were some of the people who would be standing up and speaking out about it? So instead of seeing these women as your antagonists, somehow they hate you, see them as people who are strong and leaders and have the kind of qualities that many of you aspire to, you know? And that's how I responded to it emotionally. It was more like, yeah, this is really great. And then I remember writing an article, a column for the paper, which was called A Man Can Only Imagine. So I was 19 and I was trying to articulate how it must feel as a woman, especially around the issue of personal safety. There's other issues, obviously. And how I would feel how I as a man would feel if I were a woman. And at the same time, this is in my life that I was thinking about as a white person, how would I feel if I were a person of color and had to deal with the daily indignities of racism, and how ticked off I would be if I had to deal with that. And then as a heterosexual person, thinking the same thing about heterosexism. All of this was happening at the same time for me, and I was downloading all this information very quickly. And I also realized, as a man and a heterosexual white man, I was in a position to do something about it. So I started speaking out. And because I was a really good athlete as a young guy and a really good football player, I was totally unintimidated by the male sort of sports culture or what a guy's going to think. I didn't really care what guys think, if you will, to be honest with you, because I was confident enough to say, I'm going to do this regardless of what somebody else says. And by the way, that's an important lesson. There's a lot of guys out there, a lot of men out there who have social capital in male culture, who haven't used it in one iota on these matters, on issues of gender equality and gender justice and gender violence prevention. A lot of really good men who have incredible platforms of influence who haven't used it in these areas. And I think that if we can tap into some of those men, this is my life's work really, we can be transformative, and the changes can happen much more quickly than they've been happening. Much more quickly if we get the buy-in of some men who can join with women on these matters. And by the way, Coach Marshall, the football coach here, who spoke this morning at the breakfast, is an example of the kind of man who he's not a scholar of gender issues or gender violence, but he's a really successful player and coach who has an incredible platform. And he's, for the last 5 or 6 years, been engaged with Peter and with the center and giving these talks at these Father's Day breakfasts. And he's the kind of guy who, as an ally, can be incredibly effective because of his position, if you will. And there's millions of those guys out there. Millions of them out there. We don't have to, quote unquote, convert the most openly misogynist men to make the transformative change. We just have to engage men who are already good men, who care about justice and fairness and nonviolence, and haven't really thought about these issues in the way that we need to push them to think about. Okay, anyways. So I realized I was in a position to do something about all this, and so I started speaking out and writing in my column and organizing student activist groups and things like that. And I started hearing from women around me and realizing, oh my God, this is way bigger than I even thought. These are way bigger problems. I also, from the beginning, understood the issues of gender violence as intersected and connected with every other issue that I, as a young man, was concerned about, because these issues are interconnected and intersected with virtually every other major issue. And that, by the way, is something I say in all my talks, that the idea that somehow domestic violence and sexual assault are important issues, but there's a lot of other important issues too, I don't think you get it. Domestic and sexual violence are centrally involved and intersected with virtually every other problem you could name. And we could have a game, we're not going to do it, but we could have a game later where you come up with an issue and try to come up with a social issue or a social problem in like North America or the globe, and quiz me or others about, okay, what's the connection to domestic and sexual violence? And I guarantee we could come up with a domestic and sexual violence connection for almost every problem you could come up with. And some of them are overt. They're not just like some esoteric intersection. They're like overtly connected. And that's one of the challenges, I think, for our work going forward, by the way, is making these connections, because there's so much more power in coalitions than there are in individual organizations. And there's all kinds of groups up there in London and everywhere else who are doing good work. They don't even understand that right across the city, there's another organization that's doing good work too. And there's lots of points of intersection, and yet there's no direct connection being made organizationally, politically, even intellectually or academically. Now that I've said that, I just give you one example. And I know, there's so much more, as you all know, there's so much more to all of this. Gang violence. I've been working in several U.S. cities where there's a gang violence work happening in one part of the city, and then there's, on the other part, there's like domestic and sexual violence people doing their work. And it's like there's very little overlap between the two. Meanwhile, we know from decades of research all the interrelationships between gang violence and domestic and sexual violence and perpetration and victimization. There's all kinds of overlaps, but you have some of the reasons why people haven't connected is gender politics and racial politics and class politics. So the gender politics is, in the gang violence world, it's dominated by men. The domestic and sexual violence world, by women. The gang violence people are more likely to be black, and in the Latino, in the States certainly that's the case. And in the DV and sexual assault work, while it's multiracial, there's still, the leadership is more white than other. And then there's class issues, because there's sometimes women who in the DV and sexual assault world who have much more connection to, say, academic world, or they have more means, if you will, economically, whereas in the gang violence prevention world, it's more gritty, working class, kind of in poverty, kind of impoverished communities. So for these reasons, there's a lack of real intersectional and organizational connection, but there should be. And the issues are directly related, and people should be working with each other. If we're going to be smart in the 21st century, we're going to make these kind of connections and not keep siloing our issues. And I think it's one of the ways, by the way, for the domestic and sexual violence field to get more money and funding and support and kind of juice to get the work done if we make those connections even more overtly, not just quietly working with people, but actually overtly building coalitions with other organizations. And by the way, just one last point about this. I mean, the issue of childhood trauma and the trauma-informed care revolution. Boston, my home city, is one of the world capitals of the sort of trauma research. We have to be talking about trauma, not just among women who are victims of sexual assault and domestic violence, but men who are the victims of child abuse, who then become perpetrators of sexual assault and sexual violence, because there's so many relationships between trauma that boys experience and cultural conditioning for boys and young men, which is, you know, basically somebody took something from me, I'm going to take it from somebody else, which is why boys who have been abused are something like 10 times more likely to become abusive of others than boys who haven't been abused. Girls who have been abused are much more likely to turn inward and hurt themselves and put themselves in greater positions of risk. But boys are much more likely to externalize their pain, right? I mean, so we have to talk about all of this in the context of bringing people from other areas. There's a whole world out there of people working with, you know, youth violence and youth violence prevention. They don't know anything about the domestic and sexual violence world. Meanwhile, so many of the acts of violence that they're dealing with among the boys and young men have some of their roots in violence done to those boys in childhood and the trauma that those boys experienced. And by the way, I said this last night. I said it. I'll say it again if you're interested. This term "children who witness" domestic violence, this is in the field. We've been talking about this for the last 20 years, right? Children who witness domestic violence. And sometimes people shorthand that to say children who witness. This is a term that I don't like and I don't use. Because if you're a 7-year-old kid cowering in the closet as your father or another man is raging against your mother, you're not a witness. You're a victim. You're not observing something happening to somebody else. You're experiencing it happening to yourself. The experience of trauma is much more immediate and profound than is suggested by the passive word witness. This is a term that we use in the field, and I think it's wrong. And it's out of step with the trauma, understanding of trauma that we have developed, and that's now making its way, especially in the side of advocacy for victims and survivors. But I think that the trauma work needs to move into the social change world, because so much of the bad behavior in the world, by men and young men and boys has some of its roots in trauma in boys and young men's lives. And I work with prosecutors all over North America. They'll tell you over and over again, the people coming forward, they're just, if you look at the life histories of the people who are committing these crimes, the men and young men, it's like trauma after trauma after trauma. It's not an excuse for the bad behavior if they engaged in bad behavior, but it's an understanding, right? And you know the school to prison pipeline, right? You know that term, the school to prison pipeline, where young men, disproportionately men of color and poor men and poor white men or boys, pushed out of school or drop out of school for various and complicated and sometimes obvious reasons, and then end up more likely in the juvenile system or in the jails or prisons. And the analog for girls is the sexual assault to prison pipeline. You know this one? The sexual assault to prison pipeline, because there's a huge number of girls and young women who end up in the system, in the juvenile system and in the criminal courts, as young adults and adults, have sexual violence trauma histories, have domestic violence trauma histories. And all this plays out in gendered ways for both sexes or other sexes. In other words, beyond the gender binary and sexual binary, this stuff plays out in all kinds of ways, in gendered ways. But the way that it plays out in so many men's lives is so many men produce harm for others. By the way, the same system that produces men who abuse women produces men who abuse other men and produces men who abuse themselves. They're all connected. And I say this on virtually every talk that I give, because a lot of guys who push back against the focus on men's violence against women, they'll say, well, what about violence against men? As if people who are concerned about quote unquote violence against women are not concerned about violence against men. And I'll say it right now, I'll say it again. The same system that produces men who abuse women produces men who abuse other men and produces men who abuse themselves. And what do I mean by produce men who abuse themselves? Well, suicide is violence turned inward. You know, in the States, we have 32,000 gun deaths per year, 32,000 gun deaths per year, which is a totally shameful, ridiculous statistic. You know this. But most people don't know that 2/3 of those gun deaths are suicides. And the fastest growing category of suicide by gun is white men over the age of 50. So the same system that produces university students who are raping their fellow university students is the same system that produces adult men in Europe and North America who go to Thailand or go to South America to pay 12-year-olds to have sex. It's the same system that produces 700 million child brides married off to adult men. It's the same system that produces a white guy who goes and takes a gun to his head. It's all related. And again, sophisticated people make those connections in the 21st century. And I'm saying this to you all in part because, again, to build support for our work and coalitions and expand the number of people who pay attention, if you start making these connections, people can't dismiss you in any way. They can't say, well, what about the men? Because you've already talked about the men, if you will, and you've already opened their eyes a little bit. I'm not saying it's going to be fully persuasive to the idea that all this stuff is interconnected. And that this, because I think this stuff is central. The reason why I got so passionately involved in gender violence is because I saw it as the front edge of cultural, historical transformation. It wasn't about we have a category of victims and survivors that need to be taken care of, and so I'm going to help out. It was more like, how are we going to change the world? The world is up. How are we going to change the world? There's so much suffering in the world. And I saw gender violence as the front edge of promoting gender equality. In other words, reducing gender violence is the front edge of promoting gender equality, because gender violence is one of the first line impediments to gender equality. And to me, gender equality is one of the fundamental necessities for the survival of the human species. That's how big a deal it is. This is not some minor issue. If you want our species to survive and thrive, gender equality has got to be fundamentally part of that picture. And if you can prevent gender violence to the extent that you can prevent men from assaulting women, you're increasing gender equality, because gender violence is a depressor towards gender equality, both on a micro level of the individual relationships and families, and at the macro level. So I know I've gone way beyond what I was going to say about my personal autobiography, and now I'm like pushing up against the clock. I want to say a few things about the bystander approach. So I'm going to jump to another piece of my and our work. Can I ask a question? When you hear the word bystander approach or the bystander training, how many people, by a show of hands, feel like you are conversant about what that means? So not, maybe a third of the people raise their hand. That's not that many. Okay. So I'm going to give you a little background, and I know I'm jumping from what I just said as a much bigger sort of picture, and to now a really specific thing. And the specific thing is the bystander approach, which I think is one of the most important ideas, and that's self-interested for me to say that. So, I appreciate that, because I'm one of the architects of this approach. But I think it's one of the most important ideas in prevention that we've come up with. And yet I think that the way that some people are applying the approach is really problematic. And so I'm going to give you, for the sake of time, I'm going to give you a really brief overview of the approach, knowing that there's much more to it, okay? Please know. Is that okay? All right. Trying to get some, some feedback. So basically, in 1993, when I was in graduate school in Boston, and up to that point, the central focus of my work was getting men to speak out on men's violence against women. So from the time I was in university, that was my central goal. How do we get more men to stand with women as their partners and allies? How do we get more powerful men to change institutional practices, fund programs, all that kind of stuff? So in 1993 in graduate school, I approached the director of an institute at Northeastern University in Boston. I wasn't at Northeastern, but there was an institute called the Center for the Study of Sport in Society, and it had been created in 1984 by Dr. Richard Lapchick with the idea of using sport as the platform for social activism, especially around racism and anti-racist efforts using sport as the vehicle. The 20th century is filled with examples of race and sport intersections, and athletes of color and others using sport as a vehicle for social activism. Way before the NFL players taking a knee with Colin Kaepernick in the last couple of years, there's been a long legacy of that kind of activism around race, around gender and sexual orientation. Sports is an incredibly important institution. I knew all this. I knew the work of the center, and I was like, okay, what about getting men in the sports culture to start speaking out on sexual harassment, sexual assault? I was thinking, it works for me. I mean, I had all kinds of opportunities, speaking opportunities. People were asking me what my opinion was, because I had this background as a football player and a feminist education. So they're like, okay, if they're asking me it's not about me personally, it's because I had this, experience and background. What about making it systematic? So I approached LAPCHIC with the idea of creating a program to train initially college male student athletes to speak, university male student athletes to speak out about sexual assault, sexual harassment, domestic and relationship abuse, gay bashing. And again, my thinking was not that there was a problem in athletics of male athletes assaulting women, although there was such a problem and continues to be such a problem. My thinking was we have a big problem in our society and in the world. Men are committing incredible acts of abuse and harassment and violence against women. Where are we going to find more men who are willing to stand up and speak out and challenge those men and interrupt those men? Well, if we go to guys who already have some status in their peer culture, then they're going to have more of a disproportionate impact than the average guy, because that's how it works. That's how status works. That's how you leverage social capital. Anyways, I knew all this would be, I thought it would be effective. And we ended up getting funding from the United States Department of Education under very different leadership than the current regime. And they funded this initial program, and we were working with these big university athletic programs as well as small liberal arts schools in New England, in other words, a whole mix. And the question was, what are we going to say? It was initially just men and young men that we were working with. It eventually became mixed gender. But the question is, what are we going to say to these young men on university football, basketball, baseball, soccer, hockey, lacrosse, wrestling teams? What are we going to say to these men that invites them into the conversation rather than indicts them as potential rapists and abusers? And I say invite rather than indict because back in the day, which is the 70s and 80s, the main way that people organized or thought about what they called, say, sexual assault prevention on university campuses was organized around this binary understanding, women and men. There was no discussion about gender nonconforming individuals and the fluidity of gender and all that back in the day. It was like binary. Most efforts that were called prevention efforts focused on women and young women and girls, and they weren't prevention efforts. They were risk reduction efforts under the name of prevention. So women and girls were taught, don't put your drink down at a party because a guy might drop a rape drug in your drink. Look in the back seat of your car before you get in. Have a man's voice in the voicemail. If you're going to be drinking alcohol, have a buddy system. Know where your friends are, who they're with, who they go home with, etc. All the stuff that still, to this day, we teach women and girls in urban areas, suburban and rural areas. And it's not bad advice, but it's not prevention. It's risk reduction. Because true prevention means going to the root cause of the problem, and women and girls are not the root cause of sexual assault problem. When men and boys were focused on back in the day, it was almost always as perps or potential perps. So the spirit of the educational message to guys was, you guys better listen up. You better know your what the law is in the province of Ontario around sexual consent, especially involving alcohol. And you need to know if you're with somebody and you're pushing sexually forward and you're not sure if they're consenting and you keep going, then you could be crossing the line into becoming a rapist, basically, and you need to back off. And then with domestic violence, it's like when you're getting worked up, you're in an argument, you're in a conflict, you need to be able to de-escalate before you reach the violence floor and things, those kind of metaphors. But it was always focused on men as perps or potential perps, which means that most of the guys in the room were just tuning out the message because they were like, this isn't my issue. I don't rape women. I don't abuse women. In fact, the typical rapist on university campuses doesn't see himself as a rapist. The typical rapist doesn't see himself as a rapist. Imagine what the average guy who has never been committing rape or ever been charged with rape or anything, he's completely checking you out and thinking, this isn't my issue. And to this day, most guys will respond to these issues by saying, these are important issues, but they're not my issues. I'm a good guy. I don't rape women. I don't abuse my girlfriend. I don't harass women. Those guys got an issue. Yeah, me, I'm a good guy. Have you heard men say this? This is the norm for what men say. And by the way, can I give you a piece of advice about how to respond to those guys? One way is to say, you know what, I think we need to raise the bar a little higher for what it means to be a good guy in Canada in 2018. And just saying I'm not a rapist is not particularly impressive to me. Just saying I don't beat my girlfriend is not something guys should be getting high fives for. We need a whole lot more from men. And in a nutshell, for time's sake, what we need is more men who are willing to stand up and start challenging other men and interrupting other men's enactment of sexism and making it clear to other men and young men that acting out in sexist and harassing ways towards girls and women is not acceptable. Not just because women are going to be upset with you or the authority figure is, but because we are going to be upset with you, your friends, your teammates, your classmates, your colleagues and coworkers, because you've got an issue and we don't accept that behavior. If more men would do that, guess what? We have radical and dramatic decreases in sexual assault, sexual harassment, domestic violence. You know why? The typical perpetrator is not a sick man. He's not a sociopath. He's a normal guy in every other way. Obviously, there are sociopaths. There are individuals who are deeply disturbed. That's not the typical perpetrator. Typical perpetrator is much more normal than that. Anyways, I'm talking fast and I'm heading to the home stretch here. But I was looking at this terrain. The terrain was in the educational space around prevention. Focus on men was focusing on men as perps. And I'm like, or potential perps. And I'm like, how do we do this better? How do we get men to buy in? How do we get men to embrace this rather than be always in a defensive crouch because they're being blamed or they see themselves as being blamed? And so at the time I had a professor in graduate school, Ron Slapey is his name, who along with his colleagues was looking at an approach to middle school bullying prevention that moved beyond the perpetrator-victim binary. In other words, instead of focusing on the kid doing the bullying and the kid experiencing it, they focused on all the kids around the kid doing it and all the kids around the kid experiencing it. The goal was to get the kids around the kid doing the bullying to make it clear to that kid that what he or she was doing was not okay, not because they would get in trouble with the authority figures, the external agents of authority who were going to come into the peer culture and remove the offending party, but because the peer culture was going to police itself. Kids were going to make it clear to other kids, you can't treat kids like this. This is not okay. And you got some issues here, and this is not, you can't do this. And the goal was to get kids around the kid experiencing the bullying to make it clear to that kid, what's happening to you is wrong. We support you. What can we do to help you? The beauty of that is everybody has a role to play in a given peer culture, in a given community, because we can expand peer cultures from a group of individuals to a whole community. And by the way, it's virtual as well, because there's online communities and there's virtual communities, so this is global. But anyways, if you think about community in a broader way than just a group of people in a room together. And everybody has a role to play. In particular, it gave us a way to talk to men who would say this is not my issue. Because those men have friends and peers and teammates and classmates and colleagues and coworkers. By the way, in the second year, we added women into the mix and we started working with women. We focused on women not as the victims or targets of harassment or abuse or the perpetrators of it, but as bystanders, as I've been saying. The category is bystander, right? The category of people who are around the perpetrator and around the victim is the category of bystander. And one of the reasons why this is a problematic term for this approach is that when people hear bystander, they think all kinds of things. They think, and it's really about the word bystander in my teaching is a synonym for friend, teammate, classmate, co-worker, family member. Anybody who's not a perpetrator or victim is a bystander in this model. But the reason why the word bystander is problematic is because people always think bystander, incident. Intervene, and here's where the work has gone wrong. Not my colleagues' work, but some people's work. And then I'll wrap it, and then we can open up the floor. If you can imagine that this, and by the way, so I was saying women as friends, teammates, classmates, colleagues, coworkers, women who are not themselves directly involved in situations. How can they challenge and interrupt abuse? How can they support victims and survivors? Again, doing it safely and smartly, but everybody has a role to play in that thinking. If you can imagine this triangle as a pyramid, and you can imagine the tip of the pyramid is an incident of sexual harassment, an incident of sexual assault, an incident of gay bashing, bullying. It could be an incident of racism. That's the tip of the pyramid. But the base of the pyramid is a set of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that create the cultural context and foundation within which the abusive act takes place. So this opens up a lot more space for what we're saying and what I'm saying a bystander can do. Now, the problem in the field, as I understand it, is that a lot of people who took this teaching initially decided to move it in the direction of what became known as bystander intervention. And so the term bystander intervention entered the lexicon, and then people started focusing on the point of intervention at the point of attack. And so what happened is, in so many of the bystander programs that are running in universities in Canada right now, is that they're focusing on intervening at the point of attack, which is, to me, little more than glorified nightclub bouncer training. Okay, we don't need more nightclub bouncers. You know, in the TSA, the Transportation Safety Administration in the United States airports, it says, if you see something, say something, right? This is how people have reduced the bystander approach, which is a transformative educational practice, if done well, to a glorified nightclub bouncer training that's more like, if you see something, say something. So like you're at a party and you see a rape scenario happening, these are your options, and you need to build the skills for self-efficacy to intervene in that situation. And by the way, I'm one of the people who wrote the original scenarios that everybody uses now in the bystander world, but I'm here to say, the hardest work and the most transformative work does not take place at the point of intervention. It takes place down here at all the attitudes and beliefs that create the cultural context and foundation within which the abusive act takes place. So, for example, instead of thinking about intervening when you see a rape happening, you're a guy and you're at a party and you see a rape scenario and you need to figure out what to do. Pull the fire alarm. Do you call the police? Do you grab a group of guys? I mean, there's all kinds of things. Instead of thinking about that as the go-to sort of situation, what about thinking about this? You're a guy and you're hanging out with a group of guys and there's no women present. And one or two of those guys start making sexually degrading comments about women. And there's no women there. What do you say in the face of that? And if you don't say something, then in a sense, aren't you saying through your silence that it's okay to talk like that about women? And don't we know that sexism is a deeper, and misogyny is a deeper system than just an act that comes out of nowhere? Don't we know that attitudes influence actions? Similar to racism, if you're a white person, you're hanging out with a group of white people, no people of color in the room, you hear one or two of your white friends making racist comments about people of color. If you don't challenge them and interrupt them and say, what are you talking about? I can't say that, or that's wrong, or whatever. If you don't do that, in a sense, isn't your silence a form of consent and complicity in their racism? And don't we know that racism is not just an individual act, like a cross burning on someone's lawn? It's a system, and it's reinforced politically and economically, but also through beliefs that support those systems. And don't you know that one of the places that beliefs get nurtured is in peer cultures, just like, a group of white people hanging out and telling racist jokes or making racist comments. Same with sexism, it's exactly the same. So the hard work is getting guys to talk about not what they would do if they see their friend raping a woman, but what they would do when they see their friend making a sexist comment. By the way, if you get guys to think about 24/7 their responsibilities to challenge and interrupt attitudes and beliefs that fall short of criminal conduct, of course they're going to do something if they see a rape or a domestic violence incident in front of their face. Of course. That's so obvious. But the part that works, the hard work is down here. And so many men who are otherwise good men, and myself included, participate in some parts of our lives in helping to maintain this foundation through the choices that we make, through the consumer choices that we make, through the things we say or don't say. Right? I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. This is the harder work. And a couple other points, then I'll stop. Pedagogically, one of the innovations that I and my colleagues developed that we still practice to this day is that we have separate spaces for men and women, and people identify as men or women, to talk about this subject matter. Because however passionately committed to co-education I am, I know as an educator that there's a completely different conversation if you have a group of men talking with each other, or you have a group of women or women identified talking with each other, versus a mixed gender conversation. And you know why? Because there's way more honesty in the single gender space. So guys, if you're going to do a sexual assault prevention programming on university campuses and have men and women in the same room together, it's a fraction of the effectiveness if you have men alone and women alone. A fraction of the effect. And I've been doing this for 25 years, MVP trainings, thousands of workshops that I've done and oversee. It's completely different with men and women together versus men and women separately. Now you bring them back together, you also have intergender dialogue, because the goal is better intergender dialogue and relationships. But there's a space in the educational practice for the for the single gender space. I'll give you an example or two of why this is the case, if you're not convinced. If it's a mixed gender space and you're talking about sexual assault issues in a prevention context, and by the way, the bystander approach is one tool. It's not the totality of what needs to happen in prevention programming. It's a tool. It's very useful, but it's not the only thing. But if you have a guy says something that's victim blaming, which is pretty predictable when you're talking about sexual harassment and sexual assault, some guy is going to say something like, well, if she was hanging all over that guy, what do you expect? Or if she's wearing that kind of clothing and she's had all this to drink, you're going to complain. I mean, in other words, victim blaming is very common. And by the way, the reason why it's so common is because it's the low-hanging fruit. It's so easy. It's much easier to blame victims than it is to take accountability for helping to be part of a system that produces perpetrators. Blaming victims is much easier. That's why people do it. You understand? I mean, and by the way, coming to terms with the fact that your friend is a rapist or an abuser is much more difficult than saying, oh, she's just lying, she's just making it up. Because coming to terms with the fact that your friend has committed an act of rape or domestic violence is much more difficult. Again, this is simple. This is why victim blaming is so pervasive. It's much easier. Anyways, a guy makes a victim blaming comment, and there's a woman or young woman in the room who's kind of triggered by that comment. Understandably, what are you saying? I hate when guys say that. We have every right to wear whatever we want, and just because you wear that clothing or have that much to drink doesn't mean you have it. Every guy in the room who hears that knows that if they say something, if they agree with what the guy said, or they say anything that could be construed as kind of in the same category, they're going to be having to face the criticism. And I'm not complaining about the criticism. I'm just saying this is how it works. And they just say, you know what? I'm not going to say anything. I am not going to say anything. I'm looking at my watch. When is this thing going to be over? This is kind of awkward. And you don't have any honesty. And then if you had the same group, but it's organized. I'm not talking about a group of guys just making up stuff as they go. If you have an organized pedagogy, an organized discussion with facilitated dialogue, and guy says the same thing, a guy who's trained to do this can say something like, because he's likely not to be triggered in the same way as a woman, he would say, you might want to think about what you just said, man, because it sounds to me like you're blaming her for your behavior or for this guy's behavior. And isn't that saying that he doesn't have any responsibility for himself? And what happened to personal responsibility? What happened about strength? You know, it's like she's making him do this. Are you really want to say that? In other words, you can be gentler with the guy and make him think about what he just said in a way that is much more constructive than just reading him the riot act, in which case he'll shut down. And you can do that in a single gender dialogue in a way that you can't in a mixed gender dialogue. And by the way, women often in mixed gender settings are honest in front of the guys, especially in workplaces where, like in the military, that's an exaggeration of a normal workplace, but in the military, women in the military are so unlikely to say in a mixed gender setting that they've experienced sexual harassment, they've experienced degrading behavior, because they want to be seen not as women, but as soldiers or airmen or Marines or what have you. They don't want to be seen as women. They want to be seen as one of the, to be honest with you, one of the guys, in a sense. You follow me on this? And also, if they have any aspirations to being promoted into further positions of authority, somehow it undermines their claims to authority if they acknowledge victimization, which is not fair, but it's true. So as a result, they don't say anything. These women don't say anything, but you get them in a single gender space, and these women are like, oh my God. And I've not done these single gender spaces with women because I'm a man, but my women colleagues report it all the time, that some of the same women who are silent in the mixed gender space, when it's in a single gender space, are just completely talking about everything that's been happening to them. They see solidarity with their other female peers that they hadn't really known about even. It's a much more constructive way to do it. But what happens is, and that's the last thing, what happens is schools are funding one position, and it's almost always a woman, and so they're asking a woman to walk into a room full of men and teach them about healthy masculinity or sexual assault prevention or consent or whatever. This is the same failed educational model from the 1970s and 80s that I and others created the MVP program to counteract, because it's not fair to put women in that position, and it's not educationally and pedagogically sound. And if it's not a prescription for failure, it's a prescription for limited success. No matter how brilliant a woman is, no matter how much she knows the issues, if she's a woman talking and teaching men, there's a different dynamic than men talking and teaching other men. There is a different dynamic. And this means that institutions who are actually serious about prioritizing these matters need to spend more money, and they need to be more engaged with this process. And the final last thing that I'll say is, and because I wanted to say it for the record, and then we'll open up the floor, right, is university administrators around the United States and Canada, but will say, and I meet with lots of people over the years, they'll say things like, these issues are real priorities for us. And they'll say it certainly in front of the camera, they'll say, the safety of our students is the most important thing, and we really are committed to working together to address these issues, and sexual assault is a really big problem, and we know that we want to be addressing this in a really forthcoming manner, et cetera, et cetera. And then you'll ask the same people, you say, okay, you're making this a priority, okay, so what are the requirements for students in terms of the educational prevention side? I'm not talking about cases or incidents once they've happened. That's another complicated situation, balancing the needs of victims and survivors with the rights of the accused, and I understand it's very complicated, but I'm talking about prevention. So What are your requirements? What are you doing? How are you embedding this stuff? And a lot of people will then say, well, we have a buy-in culture here. We don't want to impose things on people. We don't want to like make them do these things. And we have these opportunities for them, but we don't really want to make them. So in other words, you're saying it's not a priority. You just said earlier that it's a priority, and then you said it's not a priority. Because if it's a priority, it's not an opt-in culture. It's like, if you want to get a degree from this university, this is what you need to do. When you're going to get a mathematics degree, do you say you can opt in whether you want to take calculus or not? No, you say, as a result of being a graduate of this university, you're going to be trained in, and this is what you're going to take. These are the courses you're going to take, and this is the education. If we're saying that we're training young men and women for the 21st century, not just to be safe in their 4 years or 6 years or whatever it is on campus, not just to be safe, but we're training young men and women for the 21st century workplace, community leadership, global citizenship, then we have to be engaging all of them on all of these matters. It's not an opt-in thing. It's a requirement, period, end of sentence. The failures in our societies have not been among the young people. It's been among the educators who have allowed year after year, generation after generation of people to go through educational institutions and not be properly trained and educated on these issues, and then we send them off into the world. And then we see the results of either the lack of understanding or the lack of accountability playing out every single day in the news. And we can do better than that, don't you think? So I'm going to stop with that. Thank you very much. So now we're going to have Q&A, right? And do people have to go to the microphone because of the tyranny of the Facebook live aspect? So please, I want people to ask questions and make comments, but could you use the microphone for everybody? Somebody will be brave and make the journey, the trek across the tundra up to that microphone. And as you're making that journey, let me just say one last thing. Have you heard of the term gender transformative? The gender transformative programming? In the world that I travel in, the global movement to engage men, young men and boys in the prevention of gender-based violence, men's violence against other men, men's violence against themselves, or bad health behavior or risk-taking behavior by boys and young men. There's a global consensus in that space, which is multiracial, multi-ethnic, and global, that the most effective programs to prevent sexual assault, harassment, and abuse and domestic violence are what's called gender transformative programs that allow young men to think about ways in which cultural attitudes and beliefs about manhood affect their behavior. If you don't talk about gender and you're trying to do prevention programming using gender neutral, men and women in the same room together, just everybody has a role to play, building skills for self-efficacy to intervene when you see situations of harm, you might not be doing damage, but you're skimming the surface. But we have to be gender transformative if you really want to be effective. And unfortunately, the place in the world that's the most out of step with the international consensus in terms of the kind of practice of education in the prevention space is the United States and Canada. We are out of step with the rest of the world because so many of the programs that are being funded in the United States and Canada are not gender transformative. They talk about developing skills for self-efficacy to intervene in situations of harm without talking about gender. And by the way, I think this is as absurd as working against racism without talking about race. And the same theory applies, by the way, because some people will say, well, a lot of white people feel really uncomfortable talking about race, and so we don't really want to talk about race because it will make some white people uncomfortable. Wouldn't that be absurd if you heard somebody say that? Well, how are we going to do gender violence prevention programming and not talk about gender? Because some men might be uncomfortable talking about gender, and as a result, we don't want to push those buttons. So we'll just say everybody has a role to play, and we'll develop skills for intervention. And we'll have men and women together, and we won't talk about gender. Are you kidding me? This is so transparently problematic. And I've been saying for years, for decades, and I say it so passionately out of frustration, you can do both at the same time. You can do bystander stuff. You can train people to speak up and talk honestly about the gender norms and the racial and ethnic norms that intersect with the gender norms. All of it can be done, but it requires administrations to fund programming. It requires them to hire men and women as well, not just women. And it requires more of a commitment than administrations, generally speaking, have been willing to make. So this is a political problem, not a pedagogical problem. I mean, it becomes a pedagogical problem, but it's a political problem at its root. because it's about power and priorities at the institutional level. So none of this stuff should be looked at as micro individual cases of what do you say in a classroom, as much as it is what is the way that the institution is buying in or not buying into the transformative educational practice that needs to happen. If it's not happening, it's not on the shoulders of the young people, it's on the shoulders of the powerful. Sorry.
Oh, I have a question from someone on the Facebook Live chat. So Jill asks, what characteristics are you seeing in the young men who are taking a leadership role in this movement?
Okay, interesting question. What characteristics?
Yes.
They're good people. They're confident young men who want to make a difference, who see injustice and want to do something positive about it. Because this is all about basic stuff. I mean, I travel all over the world, right? And I give lectures and do trainings, and I state the obvious. I'm telling you, this is what I think. Some of this stuff is so basic. And by the way, let me just say, I'll say this for the, for the record. The election of Donald Trump as president of the United States in November 8th, 2016, was such a setback for humanity, but it was such a setback for those of us who are working towards gender justice for any number of reasons, right? Right? But I think one of the lessons, there's many, of the election of Trump is that many of us have to state things that we thought were obvious. We have to say them out loud. We can't just take for granted that there's certain consensus on certain basic, obvious points about humanity and about social justice and about racism and sexism and homophobia and heterosexism. It's like we need a national or an international teach-in on the most basic concepts, because obviously millions of people in my country, mostly white people and way disproportionately white men, are so far behind the curve at understanding some of these basic things that they are easily swayed by cliches and caricatures of progressive and feminist positions. Some of it's just based in flat-out ignorance. And by the way, I also say, I'm in Canada, Jordan Peterson, the phenomenon of Jordan Peterson is a product of how many young white men are both sort of alienated, floating out there, ill-informed, and easily swayed when they hear somebody articulate talking about how men should be in charge or men should be in control in some sense because it's the natural order, and these feminists who are trying to defeat the patriarchy. And he's filled with a series of cliches that if you're not educated, you can think, wow, that's brilliant. This guy's brilliant. He's really speaking to the reality and the way that these feminists aren't really, they don't even get it. It's so embarrassing to me to watch this process take place. And I'm not saying that Jordan Peterson isn't a smart guy, but he's very narrow understanding of the complexities of some of these issues in a way that me as an intellectual, I am embarrassed that he has become such a superstar, because literally some of the things that he's saying is like, are you kidding me? But then you see all these young white men who are following him, and it shows you that we haven't been good enough on the left in progressive movements, in feminist movements, at articulating a way that those white men can think about themselves in an inclusive way, that they can be part of social justice change, because a lot of them see themselves as embattled. And in their embattled state, somebody who is speaking to them to try to explain why they're embattled and why they shouldn't be embattled is going to have a hearing. Just like Donald Trump has a hearing. Donald Trump, the Make America Great Again phrase, which he didn't create, by the way, this has been around for 50 years. Ronald Reagan said it, Richard Nixon said it. Make America Great Again, every time I've seen that phrase in the Donald Trump era, the hat, I read it as put white men back on center stage again, because that's what it really means. And not just white people, white men. And so I think people like Jordan Peterson are speaking to these white men who feel like they can't be part of positive change. I think those of us on the progressive side of the house need to articulate how they can be part of that change. And that just because you're born white and you happen to be heterosexual and you're a man doesn't mean that you're the embodiment of all evil. It just means that you have certain privileges, but we have to figure out how to speak to that in a constructive way forward. And we haven't done that as well as we should have, which is why people like Jordan Peterson have become so popular and Donald Trump was elected president. Sorry.
All right, so I volunteer with the Thames Valley District School Board, and we do presentations on consent, and we do them in the mixed gender classroom. Most of the people that volunteer with me are female, so I don't think we'd have enough to do the separate male and female presentations, but also I'm not sure if the leaders of that program know that it would be best to do them separately. I heard that they might be doing that next year. So if they were, my question, same as last night, is how do we get more men involved? Because it's a volunteer organization, and my brother volunteered with them, a few nice guys that I know, but it's mostly females. So how do we change that? If you want it to be like separate gender, we need enough men to do these presentations that I'm doing.
That's right. No, I appreciate that very much. I mean, I would say, I'm not saying that this is a satisfying answer. It can't be voluntary. If it's important, it has to be required. It has to be built in organically into educational practice. So for example, one of the things that I've been doing and advocating now for like 2 or 3 years now, and hopefully increasingly so, is this is a leadership issue. And if you're a leader, you're a young man, like today we had a lot of captains of athletic teams and leaders of athletic teams, boys, in the room. And my argument is not that we need boys and young men who want to volunteer and help out. It's, are you a leader? If you're a leader, if you're a captain, this is just talking about athletics, but there's other leadership infrastructures. If you're a leader, you need to know about this stuff, you need to be educated about this stuff, and you need to be expected that you're going to play a positive and constructive role, or you're not in a position or you're not ready to be a leader. If we can, for example, like if guys on university campus, like fraternities, you have fraternities at Western? No? Yes?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
So fraternities and sororities. If you're going to be a president of a fraternity or a sorority, but I'm focusing on the men, if you're going to be a president, a social chair, vice president, whatever, you're going to be an officer in a fraternity, you should be trained. You should have mandatory annual, this is what I'm saying, you should have mandatory annual leadership training on gender violence prevention to think about how you can leverage your position as the, as not just one of many, you're the first among, first among equals, you're in a leadership position. And it's mandatory if you want to be an officer in this fraternity. If you say, well, you know what, I'm not really, this is not my area of expertise, or I'm not kind of really that comfortable with this subject matter, okay, then you're not ready to be president of a fraternity, because we're saying that to be a fraternity president in the 21st century or an officer, you have to have these skills. And if you don't, then we'll get somebody who does have those skills. That's a way of making it a priority institutionally, where you don't have to worry that people aren't going to sign up because guys are a little nervous about this subject matter. It's like, it becomes an expectation. And if you think about all the leadership infrastructures on college campuses, on high schools, in communities, the leadership training that goes on, I mean, really? You have already existing infrastructure. You don't have to start from scratch. You just have to say to these people in these areas that are already in the training of leaders, you have to add this to their portfolio or to their toolkit, or you're not adequately training them as leaders.
Hello. I was just wondering, in terms of, you said it has to be built in, it has to be mandatory. Like, when's the optimal time to start? Because, like, I played a lot of sports in high school, and I saw a lot of sexism in the change room, even just being at the age of 14. So, is it somewhere where we start in, grade 4, 5, and 6 when kids are getting into organized sport, or do you have to wait for a certain maturity level to kind of understand what's going on, or what do you think about that?
It's a good question. I would say, like everybody says, everything should be done at age-appropriate levels, but we should start as young as we possibly can. And in the model that I developed, the MVP model, we train high school juniors and seniors to work with incoming 9th graders. We train high school kids to work with middle school kids. We don't have middle-aged intellectuals coming in to talk with middle school kids or high school kids. It's older brother, older sister, leading a discussion, facilitating a dialogue among people who are slightly younger than them, to me, is the most effective pedagogical model on these matters. So you train people who are slightly older to work with people who are slightly younger, but you can go as young as you want, and you just, you don't freak people out. You don't want to overwhelm them with violence and trauma when they're young, but you want to give them age-appropriate ways of talking about respecting each other, respecting boundaries, speaking up when you see other people not respecting people's boundaries and things like that. But it should be done at all ages, at an age-appropriate level at all ages. What we know educationally and pedagogically is we know so much more than we've been able to implement. The obstacles to implementation are not pedagogical, they're political. I'll say it again. It's funding, it's the political will, it's the politics of school boards, it's the resistance by some parents to talking about anything that deals with reality, like sex and relationships. There's real obstacles politically that we have to solve that we haven't yet solved. But pedagogically, it's not that complicated. It really isn't.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I've been a big fan for a number of years. I work here at the center, but I also co-facilitate batter intervention programs. And I know we've talked a lot about prevention here, and I actually worked at Emerge too with David Adams in Boston. And it's always with these intervention groups, batterer intervention groups, we co-facilitate with a female and a male facilitator because we want to show that sharing of power. And actually in some groups we've shown tough guys because the men really respond to that. But you know, the programs are getting shorter. They were 16 weeks here. They're 12 now here. I know in Boston they're a year long, but I'm wondering, how do we engage these men who are in the justice system, who are angry, who are, you know, trauma, they experienced a lot of trauma. How do we get them on board with this?
That's a great question. I can't, let me just say in preface to my answer, I can't do it justice. I have to say that once abuse has taken place, once a man has been abusive, for example, it's a lot more complicated than when it hasn't taken place. And I understand and appreciate the model in the batterer intervention world of men and women co-facilitating. Some of that has to do with modeling, respectful behavior that some of these guys have failed to do in their personal lives and such. So I appreciate that. So I'm not making a categorical statement that there's no place for, intergender partnership or mixed gender settings. Although most of the men in the room are men, right?
They're all men.
Right,
Yeah.
and then the facilitators are women and men. By the way, can I just share with you an anecdote? This has to do with the intersection of race and gender. And it was a Canadian anecdote, so why not? A woman came up to me after one of my talks. This is 10 years ago, and she was a woman of color of East Indian ethnicity, and she said that she had been co-leading batterer intervention groups with a white man for a long time, for 10 years. She'd been co-facilitating these groups, and overwhelmingly the groups were white men, right? And she said it never failed. There was a group, roughly a dozen men in the group. It never failed. There was always one or two of the guys would be pointing out to her, a woman of color, that these issues are big issues in her community, with no self-consciousness about the fact that it's 12 white guys court mandated for abusive behavior, but these are big problems in her community. And again, it's the lack of introspection, right, which is so manifest and obvious. And I always say true wisdom begins with not thinking about the other, it's with thinking about ourselves. And some of these men are incredibly unself-reflexive. And as you know, one of the big breakthrough moments in work with those men is when they can use the active language instead of saying she went and got herself beat up last night. And they say, well, I beat her up last night. So taking personal responsibility for their behavior is often seen as a big step forward. So I would say a lot of the stuff that I was just saying earlier is also applicable in batterer intervention. And I was talking about gender and the relationship between socialization and trauma and how men play out their stuff in relationships, and if they would attend to some of the wounds that they have in their own psyche, the violence done to them, as well as the ideologies that have been imposed in a sense on them that have been harmful. Because look, if they ended up in a batterer intervention program, they're not doing very well. Although some of them would say, well, I got everything's fine. It's just you don't blame the woman or blame the system. Can I say one other thing just for the record? I know Peter's about to give me the hook, so I can see the nonverbal cues building over there. And I appreciate it. I appreciate it. The men's rights movement, the so-called men's rights movement, and fathers' rights, and sometimes that overlaps directly, and sometimes there's some subtle differences, right? Have you all had encounters with this? All right, I just want to say this publicly for the record. Are we still on Facebook? Okay. The idea that women in the field of domestic and sexual violence are anti-male, or that the men like myself and other pro-feminist men who do this work across the racial and ethnic spectrum are somehow anti-male is total BS. I'm gonna quote the great Emma Gonzalez, this Parkland, Florida student. I call BS on that. Nothing that I do is anti-male. Nothing that the women in the domestic and sexual violence movement do is anti-male. In fact, it's the most pro-male, some of the most pro-male work that's ever been done is by the domestic and sexual violence movement led by women, because those women have had the guts to tell truth to power, to speak truth to power. They've had the guts since the 1970s to call out abusive men. Those abusive men have harmed not just women, but also children. Those children include boys. I've worked with boys for my whole adult life, boys who've been traumatized by adult men's husband's violence against their mother and against themselves. These women are the ones who have the guts to call out that violence and that abuse, and yet they get criticized. You get criticized for being anti-male. It's total BS. I don't buy for 1 millisecond that my work or other people's work is anti-male. I believe from the beginning of my activism and my passion on these issues that I cared as much about boys as I did about girls, about men as much as I did about women. That doesn't mean that I don't understand that the systems of power are unequal and men have disproportionate power. They do. And the idea that we're going to flip the switch and say that men are the ones who are being victimized is so ridiculous on so many levels. It's hard to engage with seriously as an intellectual engagement. Just like saying white people are the victims of racism more than people of color. It's a flipping the switch in the script in a way that just, it's topsy-turvy land. It's like when I used to play with my son, the opposite world. And so the idea that somehow men are the primary victims is nonsense, but men are also harmed by patriarchal notions that define manhood in very narrow ways, and many men are trapped in those systems, and they're trapped in ways that harm them as well as harm others. And everybody that I know in the field, both intellectually and activist-wise, women and men, again, across the racial and ethnic spectrum, knows all this. And yet we have to encounter critiques all the time, ignorant critiques all the time, that we hate men, that we're bashing men. It's BS. And I'll say that as loudly as I can. And we need more men who are willing to say that loudly and publicly, so that some of the criticism that women have been getting, and they don't deserve it at all, but some of that criticism should, fine, criticize me, call me anti-male, like it's going to matter to me, because I know that what I'm doing is not anti-male. In fact, I know that what I'm doing is in the best interest of men and boys as well as women and girls. So, I hope that that's emphatic enough to make the point, and maybe that'll deflect some of the thousands of nasty comments I'm going to get on the Facebook comment section. Because anytime anybody speaks for justice, especially around gender issues, especially if they're women, there's going to be this attack, the troll attacks, bashing you for hating men, and then men like me for being manginas and self-hating men. It's total BS. I'll quote Emma Gonzalez again. I call BS. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Katz, for such an enlightening and inspiring presentation. You've definitely given us a lot to think about, especially the need to break down silos in violence prevention and the importance of making violence against women and girls everyone's issue, not just a women's issue. I can see that people in the audience are already starting to reflect on their own roles and what they can do to address violence against women and girls. So on behalf of CREVAC and the Faculty of Education here at Western University, thank you again for taking the time to join us today and for your continued work and commitment to gender violence prevention.
Not for Facebook? No. We're off Facebook. Well, that was quite inspirational. I was worried you weren't going to say BS. I was worried you were going to say that's fake news or something. And I'm glad you said BS. It's much better.